Zzzpedia presents Nighttime Knowledge. The Silk Road. In 138 BCE, a Chinese diplomat named Zhang Qian left the capital Chang'an with just over 100 men. His mission was military. Emperor Wu of Han wanted an alliance with the Yue Shi, a displaced people who had been driven far to the west by war, against the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were nomadic horsemen who raided China's western borders and had done so for generations. They were skilled cavalry fighters who controlled the steppe beyond the empire's reach. The emperor needed allies who knew how to fight them. Zhang Qian was to find those allies. The party rode west out of Chang'an, past the last garrisons of the empire, and into the grasslands beyond the wall. They were heading into territory the Xiongnu controlled, and the Xiongnu found them almost immediately. Zhang Qian and his men were captured. He was taken prisoner and held among the very people he had been sent to outflank. He would remain their captive for 13 years. 13 years is not a pause, it is a life. During his captivity, Zhang Qian married a Xiongnu woman. They had a son. He lived among a people whose way of life was built around horses and movement, around seasonal migration and open sky. He learned the language, the customs, the terrain. He adapted to a world that bore no resemblance to the court he had come from. But he did not abandon his mission. Somewhere in the years between capture and what came next, he held on to the idea that he had been sent to do something, and he had not done it. Then, he escaped. With him was a man named Gan Fu, a Xiongnu guide who had been captured in war and entered Zhang Qian's service. The two of them did not turn east, back toward China. They continued west, farther into the unknown, toward the people Zhang Qian had originally been sent to find. He traveled through Fergana, through Bactria, through the Sogdian territories of Kangju. He crossed landscapes that shifted from grassland to desert to mountain. He saw civilizations no Chinese person had ever described. What he found was not what he expected. He later wrote of the kingdom of Fergana. Dawan lies southwest of the territory of the Xiongnu, some 10,000 li, roughly 3,000 miles, directly west of China. The people are settled on the land, plowing the fields and growing rice and wheat. They also make wine out of grapes. After 13 years of captivity and a journey across hostile territory, he had found people plowing fields and making wine from grapes. People living in walled cities, some 70 or more of them in the region. People not so different from the ones he had left behind. He documented everything he saw. The dromedary camel, which no Chinese person had ever seen described. The horses of Fergana. Tall and strong animals the Chinese would come to call the heavenly horses, and which Emperor Wu would later go to war to obtain. The grape wine, the walled settlements, the irrigated farmland. The trade routes that connected these western kingdoms to each other and beyond them, to places even farther away that Zhang Qian could hear about but never reach. Of the original party of just over 100 men who had left Chang'an, 2 returned, Zhang Qian and Gan Fu. Everyone else had died or been lost along the way. 2 men walked back into a capital that had sent out 100. They arrived in 125 BCE, carrying no alliance and no army. They carried something the emperor had not asked for and could not have anticipated. The first detailed knowledge China had ever possessed of the world beyond its western borders. Emperor Wu read the reports and saw opportunity. The western kingdoms had weak armies and rich goods, and a hunger for Chinese products. Zhang Qian described civilizations that could be reached, traded with, and if necessary, subdued. The horses of Fergana, in particular, seized the emperor's attention. China's own horses were small and poorly suited to the kind of cavalry warfare the Xiongnu waged. The tall Fergana horses, which Chinese sources described as sweating blood, though this was likely a skin condition caused by parasites, could change the military balance on the steppe. Within a generation, China was sending 5 to 10 diplomatic and commercial missions a year into Central Asia, some reaching as far as Syria. The Great Wall was extended westward to protect the routes. Military garrisons secured the passages through the mountains and deserts. The Protectorate of the Western Regions was established to administer the territory Zhang Qian had explored. What had begun as a failed diplomatic errand, a mission to find allies that found something else entirely, became the foundation of the longest trade network the ancient world had ever known. The routes that opened after the journey of Zhang Qian stretched more than 4,000 miles, from Chang'an in eastern China to the ports of the Mediterranean. They crossed some of the most forbidding terrain on Earth, the Taklamakan Desert, 600 miles of arid waste, and one of the largest deserts in the world, lay across the center of the route like a barrier. Caravans did not cross it. They skirted its edges, moving along the northern or southern rim, stopping at oasis settlements fed by snow melt, running down from the mountains above. Between the oases, there was nothing. Sand and wind and heat that could kill in hours. Beyond the Taklamakan rose the Pamir Mountains, the roof of the world, where passes climbed above 20,000 feet, and snow fell in every season. The air thinned. The cold deepened. Travelers who had survived the desert now hauled their goods over mountain passes, where breathing itself was labor. After the Pamirs, the routes branched and merged through the valleys and plains of Central Asia, through Persia, through Syria, and finally to the shores of the Mediterranean. The journey from one end to the other could take more than a year. Most of it was difficult. Some of it was deadly. No single merchant traveled the full length. This is one of the most important things to understand about how the network functioned. It was not a highway. It was a relay. A Chinese silk weaver sold her fabric to a local trader, who carried it west to a Sogdian merchant in one of the oasis cities. The Sogdian sold it to a Parthian caravaneer, who brought it through the mountain passes. The Parthian sold it to a Syrian trader, who carried it to the coast. The Syrian sold it to a Roman importer. Each person carried the silk a little farther. Each person knew their own stretch of the road, the water sources, the dangers, the markets, the languages spoken at either end of their segment. None of them saw the full journey. None of them needed to. The silk that arrived in Rome had been touched by a dozen sets of hands, and no one in Rome had any idea where it had come from or how it had gotten there. Most Romans believed silk grew on trees. They thought the fabric was combed from the leaves of some distant forest. A few writers speculated it was a kind of wool. Only Pliny the Elder came close to the truth. He wrote that silkworms weave webs, like spiders, that become a luxurious clothing material for women, called silk. He was the one Roman writer who understood that this fabric was made by an insect, not harvested from a plant. The rest of Rome had no idea what they were wearing or where it came from. It did not matter. Rome wanted silk and would pay almost anything for it. The fabric was light and lustrous, and to the scandal of Roman moralists, transparent. Chinese silk became one of the most desired commodities in the Roman world. Senators and their wives draped themselves in it. The gold that flowed east to pay for it alarmed the Roman treasury. Repeated edicts were issued banning the wearing of silk on both economic and moral grounds. The economic argument was that Rome was draining its wealth to pay for a foreign luxury. The moral argument was simpler. The bans had no effect whatsoever. The moral objections were vivid. One Roman senator arguing for the ban complained that he could see clothes of silk if materials that do not hide the body, nor even one's decency, can be called clothes. The outrage was genuine. The Senate that had conquered most of the known world could not stop its citizens from wearing transparent dresses. The fabric that had taken months to reach Rome from the far side of the world passed through the hands of people who spoke languages no Roman had ever heard, had become the most contentious fashion statement in the empire. Rome could conquer Gaul and Egypt and Britain. It could not conquer silk. But silk was not the only thing that traveled the roads. Over the centuries, the network carried ideas and beliefs as well as goods. Buddhism, born in India, moved along the trade routes into Central Asia and then into China, carried by monks who traveled with merchant caravans. The religion spread through the oasis cities along the route, taking root in places where traders paused and communities formed around the roads. Monasteries grew up alongside the caravanserai. Cave temples were carved into cliff faces at stops along the way, their walls painted with images that blended Indian Buddhist iconography with the faces and clothing of Central Asian merchants. By the Tang Dynasty, in the 7th and 8th centuries, Buddhism had become deeply embedded in Chinese culture, a transformation that would not have happened without the Silk Road. The road did not merely carry goods. It carried the ideas that reshaped civilizations. One of the most remarkable journeys along these routes belonged to a Tang Dynasty monk named Xuanzang. In 629, he set out alone and without imperial authorization on a 17-year journey across Central Asia to India, seeking original Buddhist scriptures. He crossed the same desert and mountains that merchants traveled, but he carried no trade goods. He returned to Chang'an with 657 texts and spent the rest of his life translating them into Chinese. Religions were not the only ideas the roads carried. In 751, Tang Chinese forces fought the Abbasid Caliphate and its allies at the Battle of Talas, near a river in what is now Kyrgyzstan. The Tang lost. The defeat was significant. It halted Chinese westward expansion permanently, but the most consequential outcome of the battle had nothing to do with territory. Among the prisoners taken were Chinese papermakers. The technology of papermaking, one of China's most closely guarded crafts, spread from those captives into the Islamic world. From Baghdad and Damascus, it traveled westward. Eventually, it reached Europe. The books and documents of the medieval world and everything that followed from them owe a debt to a group of Chinese prisoners taken at a battle most people have never heard of, fought along the Silk Road. The road's secrets were always vulnerable to those willing to take extraordinary risks to steal them. In 553, two Nestorian Christian monks undertook a mission authorized by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian. They traveled from Constantinople to China and back, a journey of thousands of miles, through territories controlled by Persia, through the Central Asian kingdoms, and into the heart of China itself. When they returned, they carried hollow bamboo canes. Inside the canes, hidden from inspection at every checkpoint and border they crossed, were silkworm eggs. The monks smuggled them out of China and delivered them to Constantinople. The secret that had made Chinese silk the most valuable commodity in the ancient world, the knowledge that silk came from a specific insect, and the eggs of that insect was now in Byzantine hands. Mediterranean silk production began in earnest, particularly in the region of Thrace. A monopoly that had lasted for centuries ended because of two men and a set of hollow canes. It was industrial espionage on a civilizational scale, a 6th century heist that changed the economics of the ancient world. Even so, Chinese silk remained superior to what other weavers could produce. Byzantine coins have been found in Chinese tombs of the following century, evidence that the trade continued even after the secret was stolen. But there was a deeper question beneath all of this, beneath the silk and the religions and the stolen secrets. The road stretched 4,000 miles. It crossed deserts and mountains and the territories of empires that rose and fell across 16 centuries. Goods moved along it for over a millennium. But who exactly was doing all this carrying? Who were the people who actually moved the goods, the ideas, the secrets from one end of the network to the other? For roughly 600 years, the answer was the Sogdians. They were an Iranian-speaking people from the oasis cities of Central Asia, Samarkand, Bukhara, and the smaller settlements scattered across what is now Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. They were not conquerors. They were not empire builders. They built no monuments that survive and left no dynasty that anyone remembers. They were merchants, translators, and go-betweens, and they dominated the trade of the Silk Road more completely than any other group in its history. Their language became the lingua franca of Central Asian commerce as early as the 4th century. Their alphabet became the foundation of later scripts across the region. They were polyglots who could negotiate in Chinese, in Turkic languages, in Persian, in whatever tongue the transaction required. They served as paid translators as often as they served as traders. It was said that Sogdian boys were sent on trading journeys from the age of 5 and were trading independently by 12. Whether or not this was precisely true, it captures something real about a culture built entirely around commerce. To be Sogdian was to trade. The two things were inseparable. The evidence of their dominance is scattered across the historical record in fragments, the kind of fragments that only emerge when archaeologists and historians know to look for them. A tax document from the city of Turfan, dated to the 620s, records 35 commercial transactions. 29 of them involved a Sogdian trader. Not a majority, nearly all. Communities of over 1,000 Sogdians established themselves throughout Central Asia and deep into China. They carried not only goods, but religions. Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeism, and Nestorian Christianity all traveled the Silk Road in Sogdian hands. They were, in a sense, cultural bees, pollinating every civilization they touched. Their influence on Tang Dynasty China was remarkable. In Chang'an, the Tang capital and one of the largest cities on earth in the 7th century, Sogdian wine shops were a common sight. Sogdian musicians and dancers performed throughout the city. The Sogdian world dance became fashionable at court and spread to all levels of society. Ladies of the Tang court adopted Sogdian men's fashion. Caftans, tapered trousers, and boots. The influence ran deep. A Chinese imperial capital, 3,000 miles from Samarkand, was shaped in visible, daily ways by a people most of us have never heard of. And then there is the letter. In 1907, archaeologists exploring the ruins of a watchtower on the Great Wall of China found a piece of correspondence dated to 313. It was written in Sogdian. It was a business letter sent from a Sogdian merchant somewhere in northern China to colleagues in Samarkand, warning them that the city of Luoyang had been sacked and that northern China was no longer a profitable market. The northern routes had become too dangerous for trade. Consider what that letter is. A piece of parchment written by someone whose people no longer exist, in a language that no longer survives as a living tongue, found in the ruins of a military fortification that had been abandoned for over 1,000 years. It was a memo about collapsing markets, and it survived 16 centuries, buried in the wall of an empire. It is the kind of artifact that is almost dreamlike in its specificity, a fragment of daily commerce preserved by accident in the wreckage of a world that is completely gone. The Sogdians thrived because the road was fragmented. Many empires, many borders, many middlemen, and the Sogdians were the middlemen who spoke every language and understood every market. Then the Mongols came, and fragmentation ended. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century were devastating. Cities that had flourished along the Silk Road for centuries, Bukhara, Samarkand, and others, were sacked. Populations were scattered. The destruction reshaped the landscape of Central Asia. But the empire that rose from the conquests created something that had never existed before. By the middle of the 13th century, the entire length of the Silk Road, from China to the borders of Europe, was under the control of a single political system for the first time in its history. the Mongols had destroyed the old order. In its place, they built something unprecedented. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, lasted roughly a century, from about 1250 to 1350. The Mongols maintained a sophisticated postal relay system called the Yam, with stations spaced 20 to 40 miles apart across the full width of the continent. A rider carrying a message could change horses at each station and cross the empire in days rather than months. Caravanserais, roadside inns offering shelter, water, animal fodder, and news, were maintained along the routes. Local tribute systems that had previously extracted tolls from travelers were abolished. For the first time, a merchant could travel from one end of the road to the other without crossing a hostile border or paying a foreign tax. The roads were, by the standards of the age, safe. Trade flowed more freely than it ever had. It was during the Pax Mongolica that European travelers first crossed the full length of the road. The most famous was a Venetian named Marco Polo. He left Venice in 1271 with his father and uncle at the age of approximately 17. He did not return for 24 years. He spent much of that time in China in the service of the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan, traveling through provinces and cities that no European had seen or described. His account of the journey, dictated while he was imprisoned in Genoa years later, became the Western world's primary description of China and the Silk Road for the next 2 centuries. It was widely doubted in his own lifetime. People called him a fantasist. He appears in no Chinese records of the period, a small and unexplained gap in the historical record that historians have debated for centuries without resolution. The road had never been more open. Gunpowder, papermaking, printing, and other technologies moved westward along the Yam stations and the caravan routes. Silver and horses and fine cloth moved east. For a century, the network functioned as it was always meant to. A continuous chain of exchange stretching from the Pacific to the Atlantic. The system the Mongols had built by conquest was, for a brief window, the most efficient long-distance communication and trade network the world had ever seen. And then the same roads began to carry something else. The plague originated in Central Asia. By 1331, it had reached the Mongol courts of China. It moved westward along the trade routes, the same routes that carried silk and paper and travelers. The infrastructure that had made the Pax Mongolica a golden age of commerce now accelerated the spread of the worst pandemic in recorded history. The relay stations that had carried messages and goods with such efficiency now carried disease with the same efficiency. The safe roads, the open borders, the system of movement that connected the width of the known world, all of it carried the plague from city to city, from province to province, with terrible speed. In 1346, Mongol forces besieging the Genoese-controlled port of Kaffa on the Crimean coast catapulted plague-ridden corpses over the city walls. It was an act of deliberate biological warfare, documented in contemporary accounts. Genoese ships fled the city and carried the disease to the ports of Italy. From there, it spread across Europe. The scale of death was beyond anything the world had experienced. Somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's population died. Across the breadth of Afro-Eurasia, estimates suggest the toll may have reached 100 million people. The same network that had carried civilization's greatest achievements, silk and Buddhism and papermaking and mathematics, had carried its worst catastrophe. The road's greatest virtue, that it connected the world, was also its most terrible power. The Mongol Empire fractured under the weight of succession crises, revolts, and the demographic devastation of the plague itself. The Pax Mongolica ended. The road returned to the dangerous fragmented system of earlier centuries, and this time it would not recover. The end came quietly. In 1453, the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople, placing a new and aggressive gatekeeper at the western terminus of the overland routes. European powers, Portugal, Spain, Venice, Genoa, began searching for ways around. They found them at sea. Portuguese navigators rounded the coast of Africa. Spanish ships crossed the Atlantic. Maritime routes were faster, could carry vastly more cargo, and cost roughly 1/5 of what overland transport cost. A single ship could carry more than a caravan of 1,000 camels. Ships replaced camels. By the middle of the 15th century, the Silk Road as a functioning network had effectively ceased to exist. It was not destroyed, it was not conquered. It was made obsolete by a simpler economic fact. The sea was cheaper. And then, centuries later, a German geographer gave it a name. Ferdinand von Richthofen made 7 expeditions to China in the 1860s and 70s. In 1877, he published the term Seidenstrasse, Silk Road, in an academic paper. It was a scholar's label for something that had never had a single name while it existed. The people who used the routes called them by the names of the towns they connected, the passes they crossed, the deserts they skirted. The idea that all of it was one thing, one road, one system, came only after it was gone. The name caught on slowly. It entered common usage only in the 20th century. The thing itself had been dead for over 400 years, before anyone thought to call it anything. There is something fitting in that. The Silk Road was never a single road. It was a network of overlapping routes, shifting over centuries, maintained by no one government and mapped by no single traveler. No one who used it ever saw the whole of it. A Chinese silk weaver in the 1st century knew the merchant who bought her cloth, but she did not know the Sogdian trader who would carry it west, or the Parthian caravaneer who would bring it through the mountains, or the Syrian who would sell it onward, or the Roman who would eventually wear it. Each person in the chain saw only their own stretch of the journey. Each person carried something a little farther than the last. The Sogdians, who held the center of that chain for 600 years, vanished from the historical record so completely that scholars did not rediscover them until the 19th century. Their letters survived in watchtowers. Their tax records survived in desert archives. But the Sogdians themselves, the polyglots, the go-betweens, the merchants who spoke every language and carried every religion, are gone. The monks who smuggled silkworm eggs in hollow canes changed the economics of half the world and left almost no trace. The caravans that crossed the Taklamakan and the Pamirs did so year after year, decade after decade, century after century, and the desert swallowed their tracks each time. For 1,600 years, the world was connected by a chain of strangers. A Roman woman who wore Chinese silk was wearing the labor of a person she would never meet, carried across deserts and mountains, and the territories of empires she had never heard of, by people who spoke languages she could not imagine. The silk arrived. The connection was real, but neither end of the chain could see the other. Neither end knew the other existed. The road made the world smaller without making it knowable. It carried silk and Buddhism and paper and plague along the same paths, through the same mountain passes, past the same oasis wells. It connected civilizations that would never meet each other directly. And when it was gone, replaced by ships, fragmented by empires, buried by sand, we gave it a name, as though naming it could make visible what it had always been. A chain of trust between people who could not see what they were part of.